All right. Good morning, class. Good to see you. I'm glad to see all of you here today. We'll start as we always do in any prayer requests that we might have to keep on our minds, our hearts.
I do. My sister Nancy.
Nancy? Okay.
For surgery.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? All right. If you'll bow with me. Most glorious Heavenly Father, it is always our privilege and honor to be able to turn to you, to speak with you, and to know that you're listening. And not only are you listening, but you're ready to act upon what we may request or what we may say in our talks with you through prayer. We ask, of course, that you be with us as we conduct this class today, that we will each one gain something from your word, something that's either new to us or something that we haven't applied lately, and that we can improve our lives by taking things from your word and making it active in our daily lives. We ask that you be with the many that we have on our prayer list that we're aware of, that need you in some way, that you give comfort, that you give strength, and that you will give healing. And we ask that particularly for Nancy and her recovery from surgery, that you'll be with those that are administering to her, that will go well, she'll receive full health. We ask that you be with our missionaries around the world, that your kingdom can go forward, and that you will find a way to bring peace, to allow it to not be hindered. We ask always for guidance as we conduct our lives, and particularly as we go through this class. And we pray this in your Son's name. Amen. So, for those who weren't here last week, we started a new class, and we recycled the teacher, so it's me. So we're talking about Here I Am. And this week we're going to talk about Abraham and Isaac. So for a little bit of quick review, we're talking, and this came about because of looking at the fact of the use of repetition in the Bible. We see repetition in stories. We look briefly at Matthew chapter 13, which has two stories, two parables, the treasure in the field and the pearl of great price, which are virtually the same basic ideas, sending the same message from that. But they're there together to emphasize what they're trying to share from that. We saw repetition in Pharaoh's dream. He dreamed two different things with exact same meaning. To make it very clear, as Joseph said, that God wanted him to know about it, that it was important, and that he wanted to make it clarify what he was trying to communicate about the 7 years of famine and the 7 years of bumper crops and 7 years of famine, and how to deal with that. We saw repetition in learning the law, that people were supposed to recite it at all different times of the day. They were supposed to recite it in different places, and they were supposed to share it with their children, and all those types of things to get it really nailed into their psyche, into their thoughts and their patterns. And we saw also, and the one we'll deal off of in this class, is there's a lot of repetition in phrases. Sometimes, like we saw in the book of Joshua, within a book, where it talks about being strong and being of good courage, God encouraging Joshua, and Joshua turning around and encouraging the people as they did conquer the land of Canaan. And we'll look at one of those phrases as we go through this. The purpose of repetition, we looked at it in literature. It's for clarity. It emphasizes stuff. Make it clear if we use it over and over again. And maybe you can even highlight some deeper meanings. When we're looking at it in teaching, teachers would say that's the way that we get people to remember better and to retain that knowledge for a longer period of time if we go over it over and over. And that's even what a speaker will do. A speech, is often said, what do you do to do it? Well, you start out telling people what you're going to say, you then tell people, and then you tell people what you told them. So 3 times you'll make the same points from that. That's so that it makes it easier to remember and longer that they can retain that information. And in the Bible, we can see both of those purposes, for clarity and emphasis, and the remembering and retaining that information is both what's used in there. So we're looking at the repeated phrase, here I am. It's more than 20 times that we find it in the Bible. The vast majority of that, I think all but once, is in the Old Testament. And it was spoken by 17 different men. Most of them are are people that we're very, very familiar with, that we would think of as some of the main characters in the Bible, will at some point or other say that phrase, and that's what we're going to spend time looking at throughout this quarter. So we're starting with Abraham and Isaac, because I'm going to go through it just not chronological, because the Bible isn't chronological, but I'm going to go from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible as far as those instances come up. So the first one's going to come up, and two different people are going to say that phrase. One of them is going to say it twice. So we're going to see, here I am, spoken 3 times in the story of Abraham and Isaac. But before we get to the story of Abraham and Isaac, I think it's important that we understand more of the background of getting there, to better understand the here am I, understand the situation that we're rising in, why that situation is there, those types of things. So if we go back to where do we get Abraham? Well, first of all, he starts out with a name called Abram. That's what he was actually given as his name. He starts out in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, and he was the son, as they go through all the genealogy leading right up to that in Genesis 11, of Terah. He had 2 brothers, Nahor and Haran. Haran is only infamous because he was the father of Lot, who we know later travels with both Terah to begin with and Abram along the way from that. And Abram's wife was Sarai, right? So they were taken and they went seemingly under his father's direction. They went to the land of to go to the land of Canaan. That seems a little interesting. Doesn't that catch you a little interesting? Who do we think is told to go to the land of Canaan? Abraham, right? Now here in Genesis it tends to indicate that they were started to go that way with his father, but his father won't make it. They go to Haran and they dwelt there, and at that point God tells Abram, as Terah dies, to get out of his country, go from his father's house and go to the land that I will show you. And he makes the promises that are so familiar to us to Abram if he's faithful to him. What does he say? It says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And ultimately, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram acts on that, on this request to go to a land that he's never been to before. And he takes Lot with him, and he departs from where he had gotten to with his father on that route. And he goes from there, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to the land of Canaan. So if you wondered how that looks to the far end of things on your left, turn that way to figure out which one's yours. To your left is where they started. That's the Ur of the Chaldeans over there in the Babylonian area. And because of the desert you see in the middle, the Syrian desert, you didn't just go straight across to go over to Canaan. You wouldn't make it very well across the desert. So they go up to Haran, which is where the arrows are on the top, and then that's where his father dies, and then ultimately he goes down to the area of Canaan, and officially goes down to Shechem. So that's kind of where we can see he got more than half the way with his father before he went on the rest of the way, and God spoke to him and sent him to Canaan. So did Genesis indicate that Terah was told first? Don't know. Is it just because that's ultimately where they ended up that it talks about it from that way, that Moses put it that way? Don't know. We do know that God spoke directly to Abram and told him to go there. And Abram was what? Faithful. He went. It's a big thing. Now, we don't know much about Abram in Ur of the Chaldeans. We know that he's an Israelite. We've got his whole genealogy history of listing down to how he gets to him. So he's not by nature a Babylonian, but the Babylonians certainly weren't worshiping Yahweh from that perspective. They had a moon goddess or god, I don't remember which it was. We don't know how faithful Terah and his family were to God, or how much they might have intermingled with the people there, as was so often the case with the Israelites. We really don't know. But we know that when God directs Abram, at least, he understands who it is, and he acts on it. Through faith, he goes and makes that journey to Canaan, where God's sending him. Lets God direct him to where he wants him to go to from that. So he shows a lot of faith at that particular time. So prior to the passage that we're going to look at, which is the potential sacrificing of Isaac, what's happened to Abram to this point kind of get a feeling from it. So one of the first things that happens after he gets to Canaan is he gets there, and guess what? They decide to have a famine. Okay, they don't decide to have a famine. A famine happens to them. And because of that, you got to find food. So he thinks it's Egypt where food is, but then he, doesn't have as much faith and trust in God. So he worries about his own life because of the beauty of his wife, that Sarai was a very beautiful woman, and so he tells her, what? Don't tell people you're my wife. Tell people you are my sister. Was that a lie? Was it a lie when she said that he was his sister? Not completely, was it? They were half-brother and half-sister. All that intermingling of families, it's, kind of like the royal families from that. So you get those marrying your relatives. But anyway, that wasn't very trusting in God, was it? Not a lot of faith that God was going to take care of them when he sent them off to Egypt because of the famine. So the next thing that happens is God's blessing him and Lot at the same time, and Lot's the one traveling with him. So you may remember the story that they gathered a great deal of wealth, all sorts of animals and all sorts of other things, and their servants basically kind of got into it with each other, kind of battling with each other, because it was just really hard for all of them to be in one place and share the pastures and share the water and all that. And ultimately that required that they split up and go in different directions. And you may recall Abram gave Lot the opportunity to pick which direction to go. And Lot made what we would determine, at least in hindsight, not a very great decision. He went where it really seemed attractive, but which turned out to be very sinful, which ultimately cost him his wife and caused his daughters to sin with him in conceiving children, and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah happened along that way. We then get Lot captured, and he's led off. Abram goes and rescues him. The other part that's interesting about that part of his background is he ties to somebody called Melchizedek. What do we know about Melchizedek? Not much. I heard those people, I can see Rick going, not a lot. Not a lot. Well, why is Melchizedek interesting? He's a priest, yeah. And that's what Jesus is then, accounted for, as a priest after the order of Melchizedek. It's interesting because there's no crossing. He was a king of one of the countries or one of the cities there, but of all of them, when Abram has done this and bring the rescues and takes plunder, he gives him, a tenth of everything, and we're not really given much of a reason for it, other than that there's that level of respect for Melchizedek and his role from that. But it's interesting because he will come up with regards to Jesus later. Not our point to discuss today, but anyway. So Abram's getting really old, and so he really is still very faithful. I think it's unfair, and I mentioned this when we looked at Sarah in the men's class on Wednesdays, that it's unfair to say that he's unfaithful or she was unfaithful. They believed in God's promise about an heir. They believed in the things that were going to happen. What they didn't necessarily believe that it was going to happen by her being able to be the one to give birth to it. As it went along with it, and they go, man, that's, she's beyond the age. I'm getting too old to have that happen. Let's find some other way for God to make this occur. So, not full faith in some ways, but let's not make it that they're not faithful. He was still very faithful from that because he believed in the promise. He just thought he had to figure out a better way, or he needed to figure it out for God, and that's what we do sometimes, right? It's not working out that way, so we'll figure out for God how this needs to happen, and that's when we get into trouble, when we try to decide it for God. So he assumes his servant will be the promised heir, and God says, nope, that's not the plan. Not going to happen that way. We move on, and Sarah sees, I'm really old. It's not the servant. I can't do it. I'm beyond those childbearing years. So let me give you my maidservant, Hagar, an Egyptian, to have a child. And once she's done that and a baby's coming, she's not very happy about what she did. She knows that's kind of diminished her role with him and her position overall. And so that's a little bit difficult. But a baby is born out of that, and a male, Ishmael, is born out of that. But God assures Abram that Sarai will have a son for him. And in doing so, out of all the turmoil over that, he goes ahead and changes their names. Now it's Abraham, and now it's Sarah, to indicate that he's got that. And he sends in a covenant between them that the things that he promised is going to happen. And the act to kind of seal the deal, if you will, from Abraham's side is that all the males in his household will be circumcised from this point forward. So what happens usually at 8 days? They're having done in adulthood. We know it's not much fun because later on in the Bible, that's kind of a trick that was done to some that had defiled a woman, and they did that to weaken them all so that they go in and slaughter them all because they were suffering so much from having been circumcised as adults. So not a good thing to have go through. Strangers then come along, and they tell Abraham now that Sarah will have a son within a year. They also tell him about Sodom and Gomorrah, that it's going to be destroyed, that those are going to be destroyed. And that, of course, gets into a whole discourse between Abraham and God about, okay, are you going to kill righteous people? Well, is it going to be this many? Is it 50? Is it 45? Works it all the way down to 10 or whatever it was at the end of it, and says he'll save it for those kind of numbers from that. And he shows a lot of courage. I mean, I don't know that I would debate with God and try to get that. I mean, I would want to get Lot, but maybe I'd just ask, hey, can you send a message to get Lot out of there? But he is worried about people that are righteous, not just Lot, apparently. And he is willing to kind of put his relationship on God on the line. He has a lot of faith in that and a lot of trust in that relationship to be able to do those kind of things. So then Isaac's born, and whoops, that's what happens when I click on it sometimes. There we go. And Sarah, is concerned about Ishmael being there and sharing in the inheritance. She wants Ishmael gone. Abraham is not very excited about that. After all, that is his son. It's difficult to send them off. But God says, no, go ahead and do that. Even though she's going out into the desert, and they almost die from lack of water. But God takes care of them ultimately, and as he promised, Ishmael has his own nations from that and his own name from that. And Isaac then begins to grow up. So if we look at that, how would we classify Abraham? Has Abraham been faithful? Has Abraham been unfaithful? Has Abraham been just kind of in between? What would you think about that? Faithful with doubts. Okay. Woody? Well, tell me about both. Okay. Yep. There's a lot of things that happen in the Old Testament that God directs that we would question on Christian principles, but it's God's things to do. Yeah. So I think overall, I think it's true, faithful but with doubts at times, right? And so we get to the 22nd chapter of Genesis, which is where our focus is today. And in the first verse of that, it says, "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.'" There's our words. First time spoken, first time written anyway, first time spoken as well in the Bible, the three words that we're going to be on all this quarter. So as we look at that, who asked that question? Well, it really wasn't a question, but who made the statement that prompted the answer? Well, that was God. God asked Abraham. He just called out his name, right? Tried to do it. Why did he do it? What was it for? Well, the question was really to call his name to get his attention. Let him know that God wanted to speak to him. What a unique time that was, the time of the patriarchs, when God spoke directly to these men from that. Why did he ask that? It was part of God choosing to test Abraham. That's troubling to a lot of people. We talked about this when we studied the book of James about testing, right? Because to some people, isn't testing tempting? And God says he doesn't tempt man. So what is this testing about? Well, let's look at it some. There's lots of places it comes into the play. If we look into Exodus 16 chapter in verse 4, we find God testing Israelites with manna, the bread from above. They're begging him and fussing about having food. And Moses writes, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day that I may test them.'" And then he gives a reason. Why am I going to test them? I want to determine whether they walk in my law or not. So it wasn't a tempting them to not do it. It was a test to see whether they were going to follow through on that. Right? You really say that you're going to do this, and this is what you want. I'm going to see whether if I give you what you ask for, you're going to walk in my law. You're going to do it. In this case, he said, I'm going to see. Are they going to gather that quota every day? And that's not, at the beginning, it didn't work that way. For everybody, did it? Some of them tried to get more than that and found it got worms and rotted right away. Right? And then you had ones that tried to go out and find some on the seventh day, and he said it wasn't going to be out there. You get double on the sixth day to be able to carry it over. And it didn't rot those days. But he tested them, and some people failed the test. Most of them followed it, as far as we can tell from the Bible. Another example of that is God testing Israel in Judges, chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. And it was when they had gone to conquer the land of Canaan, but they got a bit lazy about some of the countries there and about really conquering them and wiping them out. That's what God had intended, them to be totally wiped out. Again, one of those difficult things for us to see from a Christian perspective sometimes. And what it says is, "Now these are the nations which the Lord left that he might test Israel by them. That is all who had not known any of the wars in Canaan. This was only why? Why did he test them? So that the generations of the children of Israel might be taught to know war, at least those who had not formerly known it. Namely, 5 lords of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, the Hivites who dwelt in Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon to the entrance of Hamath." So in this case, God tests them because he wants them to learn. He wants them to understand war. He wants them to really appreciate what it took to have what they now have, because now there's a generation growing up that really hasn't experienced what it took to conquer, what it took to have to go through the tough times of battle, to watch some people die, etc., to those things. And he tests them to make sure that they might be taught to know what it is to be war. Why? What do you learn out of war? Well, one thing, I don't want to be in a war. If I experience it, you see it up front. You can glorify and make it very grand by seeing films or reading books, and it can sound like a wonderful thing in some ways. Well, be gallant and all that. And for the victors and those who live, it's not that even for them, but that's what we see. We don't talk about the one that got out there the first day and was shot, and that was the end of it, or suffering and the pain of those kind of things. So he wanted them to understand, probably to avoid it as when they could, but to be ready whenever it had to come up from that. In the New Testament, Jesus tested Philip. It says in John 6, 5 and 6, "Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?' But this he said to test him." For why? For he himself knew what he would do. He wanted to see if Philip would what? If Philip would come to the conclusion that Jesus was going to be able to handle that he would be able to feed such a crowd from that. He knew he was going to do that. He was going to test and see if Philip's faith had reached that point. It wasn't a temptation to create sin. Philip didn't answer and go, "Hey, you're going to go and create lots of food from nothing. That's how it's going to happen." No, then he talks about, "I don't have much money, and we can't buy all that stuff. We're not going to be able to feed all these people." He went right to the practical from that. He failed the test, but he didn't sin. Testing and temptation, not the same thing. So really, it is about trying to help us grow from that. We're tested by fire, as the Bible talks about. It's a way for us to grow us through difficult times and decisions we make and how we act in those things. And we go back to the fact of James 1:13 through 15, that God does not tempt us. So testing is not the same thing. James wrote, "Let no one say when he is tempted, 'I am tempted by God.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death." So, like I say, difference between testing and temptation. Not always easy to see or understand in English, But that's the way God sees it. There's a testing to see how you're going to do something, but it isn't one where the outcome is sin. That's not the expectation of those things. Back to our story then, Abraham and Isaac. So we've got God calling out to Abraham. Abraham, Abraham, and Abraham says, here I am. Again, much like Adam in the garden. Did God know where he was? Yep. Did Abraham know that God knew it? Well, obviously, God's speaking to him. So God didn't speak it over in the next city because he knew he wasn't there. He spoke to him there. So it's just a recognition, I'm ready to listen. You want to, and Abraham is, got something to say to you. It's God speaking to you, and Abraham's responding and saying, I'm listening, God. I'm here. I'm listening to you. I'm going to be a part of this conversation. I'm ready for what you want to say. Going on from verse 2 to verse 3 then he said, take now your son, let me rub it in here, your only son Isaac, just in case you forgot, nor Ishmael entirely, whom you love, make it a little bit more sticking it in there, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. God makes it very clear that it's going to be very hard. He makes sure that all the things that are going to be triggering for Abraham to make it be a hard decision, a test for him completely, he's got right up there in front. This is your son. He's, by the way, your only son that matters. That's, totally legitimate because it's through your wife, not the maidservant. And by the way, you really love that child. What do I want you to do? I want you to go and sacrifice him. All right? Is that God's style? No, it's not God's style, right? God was very much against the fact that other gods, had their peoples and the leaders a lot of times, children passed through the fire, basically burned them, right? He was very, very adamant against that. That's nothing he ever asked. He was very adamant that was something was wrong. But here he's going and telling Abraham, you've got one really heir that I promised you, and now I want you to go and offer him. I know you love him, but he's got to go. And Abraham's response? So Abraham arose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. I wonder how that splitting the wood went. I wonder if it was split really well because he was a little bit upset about what was going to happen. Had a little bit more energy to put into the splitting of that wood. And maybe that's why he did it, not one of his servants. I don't know. Maybe he normally did it. Maybe he did it because God corrected him. No way of knowing. But I bet there was a little bit more enthusiasm in it. But he didn't falter about it. He got up early. He got everything set to make it there from that, and he got everything, people and the wood to go, and he went off to the place that God asked him to go to. Why did God feel the need to test Abraham? I mean, really, had he not already tested Abraham's faith by the long wait for Isaac? And the wait and directing him to go to a place he'd never been before, and he'd done that. And Abraham had believed in the heir. Yeah, he'd done some silly things about trying to decide how God would deliver on that, him and Sarah both. But hadn't he tested him already? I'd say he's tested him. That doesn't necessarily mean you don't get another test, right? Doesn't mean you only get one. Had Abraham shown a lack of faith and trust in God? To some extent, yes, right? We certainly saw it when he went to the land of Egypt and fibbed about who Sarah was. He didn't trust God to keep him safe in that situation. He certainly hadn't had enough faith and trust in God that God would just take care of it, that he had to leave it to God to produce that heir. He had to try to figure it out for God. Let me do that. So he'd certainly shown some lack of faith and trust in God from that perspective. But he had been very faithful. Faithful enough that we have him in the Hall of Fame of Faith. He's in there twice. We're looking at this one now. And Sarah, him and Sarah both noted there in Hebrews 11, 9 through 12. And by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place where he would receive an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And by faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky, and multitude innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Well, Hebrews tells us he'd been faithful, but we do know there's weaknesses in that. He passed those tests. He's already in the Hall of Fame for his faith. Sarah's there as well. But God said it still got to be tested yet again from that because of such an important thing that he was going to be doing for him, the promise that he gave him from that. Romans 4:16 through 18 adds on to that the faith that he had already had. It says, therefore it is of faith that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham. Everyone is of the faith of Abraham, not just those by the law, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. In the presence of him whom he believed, God, who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did, who, contrary to hope, in hope believed, so that he became the father of many nations, according to what was spoken, so shall your descendants be. In the grand scheme of things, why he was showing some doubt in some ways and wanting to decide how God's promise was going to be fulfilled, as I said earlier, he's faithful that God's going to deliver on that. He just wants to figure out the way that God needs to do it, execute it for God. Even though he was getting old, he believed that God was going to deliver an heir from him. And he's credited with those kind of things. So he's had faith. Wavered at times, but he's credited with that. Two different places we note that. Right? Going on from that, as it goes on, and not being weak in faith, we think he's weak, but he's not, because faith is not always going to 100%. And don't feel that you have to be. There's always going to be times when you're going to doubt. There's always going to be times when you may be like Abraham, and you're going to try to figure out how God's going to do it and do it for him. Move that along. And you do need to take some actions. There's an interesting point of where that defines out. He did not consider his own body already dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. He did not waver at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully convinced that what he had promised he was also able to perform. And therefore it was accounted to him for righteousness. Now we can point at him and say that's weakness, that's lack of faith. He didn't waver. Like I said, he wanted to decide how it happened from that. He didn't trust God to do it in his way and leave it to him. But he did not waver in believing God was going to deliver on that promise. That's what Romans says. That's what we saw in Hebrews. He was convinced, even though it was something that, just didn't seem logical because of his age, because of, he's there about 100 years old. You don't have kids at 100 years old. Your wife doesn't have kids nearing 100 years old. But he was fully convinced it was going to happen, and that's why it was accounted to him for righteousness from that. So he showed it from that, but for whatever reason, God's going to go ahead and make this test. Continuing on then in Genesis, verse 4. Then on the third day, he's headed out now with his servants and with Isaac, with his wood. On the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. God obviously gave him more specific directions than Moriah from that. We don't get everything that God speaks when he tells people stuff. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we'll come back to you. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. He took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. Isn't that a nice picture? Isaac's off to go be sacrificed. He's carrying his own wood to burn himself. Not realizing, of course, that that's it. But of course, that's because that's the safest thing to give him, right? The two most dangerous things, the fire and the knife, Abraham keeps to himself and carries him from that. So now we get to some consistent words again in verse 7. But Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? So again, It's not a question that he gets an answer from, because Isaac knows where his father is. He's just trying to get his father's attention so he can ask him a question. And that's why Abraham is answering, I'm here. I'm ready to take your question. I'm ready to respond to you. What is it you want to ask? Did Abraham know what he wanted to ask? Probably. He's probably wondering why he didn't ask you sooner. We were going off. We got wood. We got fire. We got a knife. We've left home with that stuff. And we're going to sacrifice. It took you this long to ask me what it is we're going to sacrifice? We don't have something? I can see all those things, but, at least at this point, Isaac just figured maybe they're going to buy something along the way. I don't know what it is, but he's now going to ask that question. And then that's going to be the session. So who asked the question? Isaac asked Abraham this time. He's calling out his name to get his attention, to ask about the sacrifice, because Isaac's confused. How are we sacrificing if we don't have an animal? Very logical reason to ask his father that question from that. And so we get the response from that. Abraham doesn't tell him the direct truth immediately, does he? Doesn't want to startle him from that. We don't know how that must have gone down with Isaac once it did get fairly obvious from that. But he says to begin with, and Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." Now, we don't necessarily believe that's what Abraham thought. It sort of didn't turn out to be a lamb anyway, because the indication is from the places that he thought that even if he did sacrifice him as God, that he would, as God directed, that God would be able to resurrect him. So don't necessarily believe that he thought they were going to have a lamb. But that's what he told Isaac from that. So that satisfies Isaac enough. So the two of them went together. And they came to the place of which God had told him. Clearly God was very specific about where it was. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Don't you wonder how that went down? Isaac seems to be a pretty obedient child at this point, but Dad's tying me up. This doesn't seem appropriate. Doesn't seem likely from that. Now he's putting me on the altar. Maybe he's just testing to see it'll hold weight. I don't think that's the answer. He just wants to see what pitch. No. And then put on top of the wood. Now that seems to be a little concerned. You wonder how Isaac's responding during this period. And you wonder whether Abraham is stoic, whether he's crying, what might be going on that. We don't know. Verse 10, and Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But we have to have the third time we get the question or the statement made. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And so he said, "Here I am." So one story where we'll have it in there 3 different times. Right? The question comes out there, the call comes out. So the question, again, now is the angel of the Lord. I'm not saying it's God himself, but the angel of the Lord, a lot of times thought to be from other kinds of passages and stuff. Perhaps that's the Son that's calling out Jesus. Whatever. It's his messenger. That's what an angel is. And calls out to him. He's calling Abraham's name to get his attention because he wants to stop the process. Abraham has passed the test. And before he carries it out, because he doesn't need to carry it out, it's clear he's going to do it. God can read his motivation. He's not just pretending, "Okay, God, stop me. I've got the knife. I'm halfway down, God. I'm 3/4 of the way down." You gonna stop? No. He's ready to do it because he's convinced that that's what God wants. I'm going to do what God wants, and God will make it still work out where the promise is fulfilled from that. So, what does the angel say? And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him." For now we get the purpose of the test. "For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." The ultimate test of him. Every other test, yeah, it's hard. Leave all your family and go to a foreign country. Is it hard to leave? Sure. It's hard to leave. Leave family, go somewhere you don't know. It's trepidation, wondering what's going to do that. But you've got your wife and you got some other members of your family. It's, you've got your whole household moving with you. Okay, that's not so bad. You live through all the other things that's out there that God had out there, and waiting for that child. It's tough to do, but again, it's not painful in any emotional way other than just frustration out of it. But now, this temptation, this test, not bad, Bob. This test is the ultimate one because they talk about the one thing he loves the most, his son. And God knows that God is loved even more by him and trusted more than that because he's willing to slay him for him. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." God ultimately provided relief from having to sacrifice his son and the sacrifice to provide from that. Nope, that's it. No, there's more of it. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn," said the Lord, "because you have done this thing, and not withheld your son, your only son," again, remember that, "blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Through him, everybody's going to be blessed. That's obviously going to happen way down the road through Jesus, making salvation available to everyone, but it's going to come through his seed because he's faithful. So Abram showing his faith. He left his country without knowing where he was going. He believed in an heir even in his old age. Shouldn't that have been enough? No, not for the promise that God was giving him. To be the father of the nations and all that, it took more than that. So some questions. Did the answer of "here I am" come willingly each of the 3 times? Yeah, I think so. Abraham had no sense that God was going to ask anything bad of him or anything difficult of him when he called out to him, so he had no reason not to be willingly to say, "Here I am, God, I'm ready to listen." And he had no reason, he might have had a little trepidation when Isaac called out to him, because he knew what was coming, what Isaac was going to ask, but he was ready to answer him. It was fair. And when the angel called, I think he was relieved to answer, "Here I am," because he thought, surely he's going to, I'm going to get a new direction here. We're going to do something different. Did it come with concern any of the 3 times? Yes, I think it came with concern the last 2 times. Maybe even a little the first time. God's speaking to me. I don't know what he wants to say. So I think it did those times. Did it come with a welcome answer each time? If we look at the real question, not the "here am I" response, but the real question, the first one is, you're going to sacrifice your son. Willing? Yeah. Not welcome? I wouldn't say he was very welcome in doing that. I wouldn't have been very welcome to do that, even if you had faith in God. Okay, let's go kill my son. That sounds great. Let's go. The second one, welcome answer, was a struggling answer. It was a lie. I don't think that was very welcome necessarily. The last one, yeah, we're really happy about that one. Don't slay him. You've proven your point. You've passed the test. And the final outcome is certainly positive for everyone except maybe the ram. It did lose its life in that process. But everybody else, I think, came out pretty positive in this one. Here I am from that. So Abraham's faith, the second time. He's in the Hall of Fame twice. So in 17 through 19 of Hebrews 11. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, "In Isaac your seed shall be called," concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. So it's indicating that it wasn't, that the story about the lamb wasn't really necessarily what he thought, could be, but he just felt confident that God would still carry it out, even if it took raising him from the dead. James chapter 2, 21 through 24 says, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only." God wanted to see that his faith was real by giving him a test. Did he have that much faith? Unfortunately for everyone, although God would have found another way to do it, but Fortunately for everyone, Abraham passed the test, a very difficult test from that. And it became something that we'd all love to have, to be called the friend of God from that perspective. So ask yourself, could you have answered and acted as Abraham and Isaac did in this situation? Think about how much faith each of them had to have possessed to be able to respond that way. Looking ahead, our tentative schedule, we've got Abraham and Isaac. Next week we're going to talk about Esau and Jacob. And skip all the rest of those. And our scriptures next week, for anybody that wants to jot them down and know what it is to look at this week. Obviously, our main storyline is a narrative in Genesis where we'll see those words, but we'll see mentions that tie back to it in Romans and in the Hall of Fame in Hebrews again. Any comments? I didn't give much opportunity for that. Stan.
Yeah, I know we're over, but
It's my fault.
after this, God never tests Abraham again.
That's right.
This was the final test. As we get older, we tend to look back at our life and say, well, I could have done this different or that different. And Abraham certainly had lots of reason to doubt his faith. But at the very end, God blessed him with this test. Because it showed Abraham that, yes, he really did have that faith. That he was faithful to God, and he could then live out his days knowing and not having those doubts.
Absolutely. And we need to do the same kind of things. We tend to look in when we have weakness, and we all will have weaknesses even after that. We don't know. Abraham still probably did things at times which may not have been as trusting as he needed to. But he had this huge event to look back on and know.
No doubt.
No doubt about it at all. And we probably have some of those events as we've gotten older that we can look back on.
And should have that same kind of comfort from that. Not as dramatic as Abraham had. All right, well, we're over, so appreciate you, and we'll see you all next week when we talk about Esau and Jacob, and here am I.